Imagine this, a boy born into grinding poverty in a remote Syrian mountain village, herding sheep under the scorching sun, destined for a life of obscurity. Yet, through sheer ambition, ruthless cunning, and the tides of history, his son would one day rule Syria with an iron fist for decades, turning a fragile nation into a fortress of authoritarian power until it all came crashing down. This is the dark saga of the Assad family, and how Bashar al-Assad, the reluctant ophthalmologist, became Syria's president for life. Let's travel back to the rugged hills of Kardaha in northwest Syria in the 1930s. Hafez al-Assad was born into an impoverished Alawite peasant family, a minority sect often looked down upon by the Sunni majority. His family lived simply, farming, herding, scraping by in a world of limited opportunities. Young Hafez knew hardship firsthand. The backbreaking labor in the fields, the injustices of rural life under French mandate rule, and the sting of being from a marginalized community. But he was sharp, ambitious, and driven. He excelled in school, joined the Ba'ath party as a student activist, and entered the military academy. This was no ordinary path. Hafez climbed the ranks of the Air Force, survived political purges and exiles, and masterminded the 1970 corrective revolution that brought him to absolute power as president in 1971. Hafez transformed Syria. He stabilized a country plagued by coups, built a powerful security state, allied with the Soviet Union, confronted Israel, and elevated the Allies to key positions in the military and intelligence. He ruled with an iron grip. Crushing dissent, most famously in the 1982 Hama massacre where tens of thousands were killed to suppress an Islamist uprising. His regime brought a measure of stability and modernization, but at the terrible cost of freedom. Hafez groomed his eldest son Basil as successor, a charismatic, hard-charging figure who embodied the future of the dynasty. But fate had other plans. Enter Bashar al-Assad, born on 11th September 1965, in Damascus, the second son. Unlike his father's humble beginnings, Bashar grew up in the presidential palace, surrounded by privilege. Quiet, reserved, and bookish, he lived in the shadow of his outgoing brother Basil. Bashar studied medicine at Damascus University, graduating as an ophthalmologist in 1988. He served as an army doctor and, in 1992, moved to London for further specialization in eye surgery, a world away from Syrian politics. He seemed content with a quiet life as a doctor, far from the corridors of power. Fluent in English and French, he appeared modern and westernized. Then tragedy struck in 1994. Basil died in a high-speed car crash. Suddenly, the family's heir apparent was gone. Hafez recalled Bashar from London. The young doctor had no military experience, no deep political base, but he was the only viable son left. Bashar was thrust into a crash course in power. He trained at a military academy, rose quickly to colonel in the Republican Guard, and was positioned as the anti-corruption champion, heading campaigns that conveniently spared the inner circle. He also led the Syrian Computer Society, projecting an image of a tech-savvy reformer who could lead Syria into the 21st century. Hafez carefully engineered his son's public image, preparing the elite and the military to accept this unlikely successor. On 10 June 2000, Hafez al-Assad died after 30 years in power. The transition was swift and choreographed. Parliament lowered the minimum presidential age from 40 to 34. Bashar was nominated unopposed, and in a referendum, he won with over 97% of the vote. The world watched with cautious optimism. Here was a young, British-educated eye doctor. Surely he would open up Syria, reform the economy, ease repression, and end the stagnation. The Damascus Spring briefly bloomed. Intellectuals debated reforms, political prisoners were released, and talk of modernization filled the air. Bashar married Asma Akhras, a sophisticated Syrian British woman, and they seemed like a glamorous power couple ready to modernize the country. But the spring quickly turned to frost. By 2001 to 2002, the regime cracked down hard on reformers. Bashar proved he was his father's son, committed to preserving the Ba'athist system, the security apparatus, and family control. Economic reforms were selective, benefiting cronies, and creating new oligarchs, often tied to the Assad-Makhlouf family network. Corruption flourished. While some internet access and consumer goods appeared, the core of the police state remained untouched. Bashar continued his father's foreign policy, supporting Hezbollah, maintaining influence in Lebanon until 2005, opposing the US invasion of Iraq, and strengthening ties with Iran. The early years were marked by consolidation. Bashar navigated regional storms, including the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in 2005, which many blamed on Syrian agents, leading to international isolation and the withdrawal from Lebanon. Domestically, he balanced the old guard with younger loyalists. His rule appeared stable. Syria avoided the chaos of Iraq or the upheavals elsewhere. Tourism grew modestly, and Bashar cultivated an image as a rational leader. Yet beneath the surface, grievances simmered. Economic inequality, youth unemployment, sectarian tensions, and the suffocating Mukhbarat secret police. Then came 2011. Inspired by the Arab Spring, protests erupted in Dara over the arrest and torture of teenagers who had spray-painted revolutionary slogans. The regime's response was brutal. Security forces fired on demonstrators, killing dozens. Instead of genuine concessions, Bashar doubled down. What began as peaceful protests spiraled into armed rebellion as defectors formed the Free Syrian Army. The civil war exploded. Assad's forces, backed by Iran, Hezbollah, and later Russia, unleashed a campaign of indiscriminate violence, barrel bombs on civilian areas, sieges starving entire towns, and the systematic use of chemical weapons, most notoriously in Ghouta in 2013, killing hundreds. The human cost was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, ancient cities reduced to rubble. The rise of ISIS complicated the conflict, but Assad's regime was responsible for the vast majority of civilian deaths. Torture centers like Saydanaya became symbols of horror. Millions fled as refugees. Yet Bashar framed it all as a fight against terrorism, supported by his core Alawite base and minorities fearing sectarian reprisals. With Russian air power from 2015 onward, his forces slowly regained territory. By the late 2010s, Assad had won the war in the sense that he controlled most of the country, but Syria was shattered, economy in ruins, sanctions biting deep, and his rule more isolated than ever. Controversies defined his peak. Accusations of war crimes piled up, chemical attacks, targeting hospitals and schools, industrial-scale torture documented in the Caesar files. Elections were farces, Bashar winning with absurd majorities in rigged referendums. His inner circle, including cousins like Rami Makhlouf who dominated the economy, enriched themselves amid the suffering. Internationally, he became a pariah to the West but clung to alliances with Russia, Iran, and China. His survival seemed miraculous, propped up by foreign patrons even as his people suffered. For years, Bashar appeared untouchable, re-elected in 2014 and 2021 in controlled areas. He promised reconstruction but delivered little beyond further repression. The economy collapsed further with hyperinflation and fuel shortages. Then, in late 2024, everything unraveled with stunning speed. Rebel forces, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and others, launched a lightning offensive. Aleppo fell, then Hama, Homs, and suddenly Damascus. On 8 December 2024, Bashar fled to Moscow, granted asylum by Russia. After 24 years in power, the Assad dynasty that ruled for over 5 decades ended not with a grand battle, but a rapid collapse as the military melted away and the people's exhaustion turned to uprising. Bashar al-Assad's legacy is one of profound tragedy. He inherited a stable but repressive state and left behind a ruined nation. Hundreds of thousands dead, half the population displaced, economy devastated, and deep sectarian scars. To supporters, he was the defender who prevented Syria from becoming another Libya or Iraq, preserving sovereignty against foreign plots and jihadists. To critics and most of the world, he was a war criminal who chose slaughter over reform, sacrificing his country on the altar of personal power. His dark rise, from reluctant heir to president for life, reveals the dangers of dynastic rule, the resilience of authoritarian systems, and how fear and loyalty can sustain power until they suddenly don't. What lessons emerge from this story? Power vacuums and weak institutions invite strongmen. Reform delayed can become revolution denied. A leader's survival instinct can outlast the suffering of millions. And no regime, no matter how entrenched with security forces, foreign backers, and propaganda, is truly eternal. Syria's future remains uncertain, hope mixed with risk of new chaos, but the fall of Assad reminds us that even the darkest rises eventually face reckoning. The boy from the palace who became president for life learned too late that ruling through fear alone plants the seeds of its own destruction. The shepherd's grandson's empire crumbled, leaving Syria to rebuild from the ashes.